Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Equine Industry Symposium. Before we get into this evening's lineup, we'd first like to thank Equestrian Canada and Ontario Equestrian, as well as the Equine Industry Symposium Organizing Committee for putting together this event. The Equine Industry Symposium was created 5 years ago with the intention of bringing people in the equine industry together. This evening is organized by Araya Wildish, Anna Nakano, Priya McEwen, Rachel Wiggins, and myself, Cameron Yaw. We are all second-year students in the Bachelor of Bioresource Management degree at the University of Guelph, and we are majoring in equine management. This year's theme for the symposium is resilience, rethinking, restructuring, and reevaluating due to COVID-19. We chose this theme because COVID-19 has affected all of us in some way this past year, both inside and out of the equine industry. Just a reminder that tonight is just the beginning. We have 4 more nights filled with presentations from various speakers within the industry. Tuesday, we will talk about restructuring your business for success. Wednesday will be pandemic pressures on welfare. Thursday will be traceability and emergency preparedness. And Friday, we will discuss the silver linings of the pandemic. All will be held at the same time, and you can follow us for updates on our social media. Tonight, our speakers will be talking about the pandemic impacts on equine communities. Our speakers will give their presentations, and then we will have a monitored Q&A after all 4 of our presenters have spoken. Please note that any questions must come through during the Q&A, and we may not be able to get all of the questions through. And of course, just a reminder on the Zoom etiquette during presentations. Please keep your mics off and hold questions until the Q&A portion of the symposium has begun. And keep in mind that this session will be recorded for those who are unable to attend. Christine Reukpe is our moderator for the evening and will also be talking about the effect of COVID-19 on horse shows later on this evening. Christine is the director of equestrian and breed sport at the world-renowned Royal Horse Show in Toronto, Canada. She is also a licensed senior hunter jumper and equitation official for Canada, officiating throughout North America and the Caribbean. Today, she continues to officiate as well as freelance coach throughout Ontario while expanding her company's website for online competition, training, and equestrian education. Welcome, Christine. We are happy to have you here today.
Hey, Cameron and everybody, thank you so much for welcoming me here. And it's an absolute privilege and pleasure to be here. We have a great group of panelists here this evening, and I think it's going to lead to some great conversation. So starting us off, I'd like to introduce you to Akash Maharaj. And Akash Maharaj is the CEO of the Mosaic Institute and also serves as the ambassador at large for the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. Outside of his professional life, Akash was the National Equestrian Athlete for Canada. He rode with the Governor General's Horse Guards Cavalry Squadron and was a triple gold medalist at the International Championships of Equestrian Skill at Arms. He subsequently led the Canadian Equestrian team and the Federation as CEO to its most successful Olympics and Paralympics of all time. He continues his work on employing horses to build bridges between urban and rural communities and between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Akash has been the moderator for the past 4 equine industry symposia. Today, Akash will talk about the purpose of the symposium, the need for coming together during this time, as well as introducing this year's symposium. Thank you so much, Akash, for joining us here this evening.
Hello, this is Bello, and I'm his boy Akash. Bello is here to ensure that I do not say anything too outrageous. Good luck with that, Bello. We are delighted to open and to welcome everyone to the 2020 Equine Industry Symposium. Each year since 2016, the students and faculty members at the University of Guelph have held an annual symposium, which calls together horse people from every part of our sector and every corner of our country to build common cause to advance our common interests as a community. I imagine everyone watching this video has a sense of what a monumental task our colleagues set themselves. Horse people are a fiercely independent breed. Put a question to any 2 of us and lock us in a room together, and we will eventually come up with at least 3 different opinions and create 4 different organizations to implement them. In my experience of it, the Equine Industry Symposium is one of the few events with the standing to call us all together and the capacity to help us achieve together what none of us can achieve alone. In earlier years, the symposia have considered questions such as establishing professional standards, increasing youth engagement, strengthening good governance, and stewarding change in a frenetic world. In 2020, there is only one subject it could possibly address. How are we going to make it through the pandemic, and what kind of world should we try to rebuild on the other side? Canadians everywhere are suffering under coronavirus, and host people have certainly not been passed over. On the contrary, our community has proven to be especially vulnerable. Even during the best of times, the host sector's margins are meagre, our voices dispersed, and our interests poorly served by institutions that act in our names. We will survive this time of trial only if we pull together, even as we must stand physically apart. The pandemic has emphasized what I think all of us already knew, that our interests as individuals are inextricably linked to the well-being of every other member of society, and that none of us can enjoy a healthy, safe, and prosperous life unless we build a healthy, safe, and prosperous world for all of us. This symposium is meant to be part of that effort. On the first day, panelists from across equine industries and professions will frame the broad challenges the pandemic has set for us as Canadian host people, the economic, horse welfare, and social impacts of coronavirus. On the second day, panelists from financial industries will suggest strategies that horse owners and facilities can take to mitigate risks, to build legal and fiscal resilience, to endure what may be a harsh winter, and to prepare for an uncertain future. On the third day, panelists with professional roles in animal welfare will discuss our options and responsibilities as the people responsible for our horses' well-being in the face of the pandemic. On the fourth day, we will hear from panelists involved in animal traceability about changes they would like to see in the overall architecture for the management and tracking of the Canadian herd. On the fifth and final day, we will have two conversations with the people who regulate our sector and who are responsible for offering us competent governance and public accountability. From the government side, we will have an Assistant Deputy Minister from the Federal Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food. From the association side, we will have representatives of Ontario Equestrian and Equestrian Canada. It goes without saying that these are difficult days for us all, but we will certainly make it through together. The host community has truly ancient roots. Over the centuries, we have literally seen off wars, famine, and pestilence. We will see off coronavirus as well, because through our relationship with our horses, we understand the nature of partnership, the imperative to work together, to learn from one another, to extend compassion to each other, to protect our individual and shared dignity, to draw strength from adversity, to struggle forward in a world that does not always understand us, and to occasionally succeed despite ourselves. If you are watching this video before the symposium, you can still register for events at the link that should be appearing somewhere next to Bello's nose. If you are watching after, you can see recordings of the events at another link, which should be hovering somewhere similar. The symposium has a presence on social media, 2020 EIS at Facebook, at Equine Symposium at Instagram, both using the hashtag 2020 EIS. Participation at the symposium is free, and all the student organizers, faculty members, and speakers have donated our time, and the horses too. If you would like to make a contribution, we encourage you to consider donating to For the Herd, the emergency fundraising initiative that supports lesson horses and riding school facilities. Bello says you can also get him some carrots. Thank you for joining us at the 2020 Equine Industry Symposium. I hope you will find the proceedings helpful.
Thank you, Akash, for giving us an outline on the importance of our symposium, and we look forward to hearing more from you later on this week. Something else to look forward to during the week is the week-long raffle that we are holding. The prizes include 2 $50 gift certificates to Brooks Feeds, 2 Twisted X gift certificates up to $200, a 1-hour trail ride at Conestoga River Horseback Adventures, half off an equine first aid course, as well as many others. For a complete list of prizes, be sure to look at our Instagram or Facebook posts. The winners will all be announced on the Monday following the symposium. Extra tickets can be obtained tonight by submitting questions during the Q&A portion or sharing one of our Instagram posts to your story. In addition, you will receive an additional ticket if you donate to For the Herd. Please ensure you list your full name when making the donation. For the Herd is an emergency fundraising initiative run by Ontario Equestrian to support lesson horses and riding school facilities in the province that may have incurred significant loss during the pandemic. For anyone who has the means to donate, the link is on the bottom of the screen. You're able to choose between a monetary donation, donation of supplies, or even fostering of a lesson horse. Christine, I am going to now hand over to you to introduce our first speaker.
Great job, Rachel. Thanks so much. Our first speaker tonight is Bronwynne Wilton, and Bronwynne is the principal and lead consultant at Wilton Consulting Group in Guelph, Ontario. Here, she and her team take a systems approach to solving problems and finding innovative solutions for the agri-food sector. As part of this work, she brings her passion for and deep knowledge of the social, economic, and environmental aspects of the Canadian agri-food system. Bronwynne holds a PhD in rural studies and is experienced in managing comprehensive, full value chain research to sustainability, innovation, strategic planning, and regional agriculture and food strategies. She's trusted for her comprehensive knowledge of and commitment to a vibrant agri-food sector, as well as innovative, prosperous, and sustainable rural communities. Bronwynne will talk about the report she compiled for Equestrian Canada on COVID-19. Bronwynne, welcome to you, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me here this evening, and I really like to thank the students and faculty of the Bachelor of Bioresource Management from the Equine program for putting the symposium on. As Akash said, it's really important to have an event where people from multiple disciplines across the equine sector can come together like this. So it's really great to be here this evening with all of you. And yes, as Christine mentioned, I am going to share a very high-level compressed summary of the work we did with Equestrian Canada back in about April 2020 in response to the COVID crisis. And to do that tonight, I just want to go through a few key points that came forward that I hope will help with the rest of the symposium in terms of setting up some of these moving forward kind of discussions that the industry needs to have. So there's an issue of definition of equines in Canada, which I want to highlight. Some of the COVID-19 impacts that we were able to work together with Equestrian Canada on to communicate to the government, and then recommendations moving forward. So as you all know, in March, COVID started and became in full force across Canada, certainly in certain areas more intensively at first, but eventually across the entire country. And as part of the lockdown to try and stop the spread of COVID, equine operations were part of that initial stage of lockdown. So lesson barns, anything running camps, boarding stables, those types of things where there was public interface. And I think one of the other speakers will speak to the racing side of that as well. And then in April 2020, and well, into March as well, but April 2020, we started communicating. Equestrian Canada really took a lead on trying to figure out a response and how to work with government on how to kind of make the case of what's happening across the equine sector to the government to try and find a proper way to respond and to provide support for any horses that were potentially facing some very serious welfare issues. So the first thing when you want to go speak to government in support of an issue that's happening is they want to know how much and how many horses and how much money would be needed. So as a lot of you will probably know, in Canada, this raises a very tricky question. How many horses are there actually in Canada? So the challenge of counting horses, and I think Danny will pick up on this as well in her presentation later on this evening, is that we do know in 2016 that the Census of Agriculture counted 291,000 horses approximately, which is great. So we do know some, but we also know that the total Canadian equine herd is chronically undercounted in the census. And just thinking of the participants on the call, this might be a question that you might want to think in the back of your head. Have you ever filled out a census of agriculture where you were able to tell the government how many horses you owned on your property or that you owned no matter where they live? So it raises an interesting issue in terms of not knowing exactly how big the Canadian equine herd is, what they do for a living, how they're used, how they live across the country. So it's a very important issue that we need to get a handle on as a sector. So the estimated error is a factor of approximately 3.9. So meaning that for every horse that is counted by the census, there would be closer to 4 horses in reality. So it does raise quite a bit of gray area in terms of how many horses are in the country. I'm just watching my time on the side here. And this brings up a second challenge that's really important when you're talking to looking for finding support to provide relief for the horse sector across the country is, how are horses defined? As we all know, probably every one of you watching on this evening probably do multiple different disciplines. There's racing, there's trail riding, there's pleasure riding, there's sport, there's all sorts of different things that horses are used for across the country, sometimes still for work and sometimes just for companions, which is totally great. But then, so why would that even matter? So this is a really important part of this, because how horses are defined impacts, in particular related to the conversation we're having this evening. In an emergency like COVID, you need to know which government department to go to for support. And in addition to that, and then Danny later on this evening will talk a bit more about the connections between horses and agriculture more broadly. So agriculture and agri-food business support and business risk management programs are targeted at what we call bona fide farms. So farm businesses that can demonstrate a certain amount of income from farming activities. And there again, you can kind of think a little bit about, okay, well, what would be farming income? On a conventional farm, you'd be selling products like eggs or milk. And what does a horse farm do that provides that certain amount of income? So those are some of the interesting pieces to look at. And in addition, and this is thinking forward to that resilience and what Akash alluded to in terms of the future we want to build, there are also programs across the country that may benefit equine farms and the broader community, which may not always be accessible to horse farm owners if you don't fall into that bona fide type of farm. So for example, environmental programs or energy retrofits for your barns or manure storage programs. So there's lots of interesting things that happen across the agriculture sector that sometimes the horse farm piece gets left out of because of this definition. And we also know that horses perform multiple roles on farms and businesses and in our communities. And these roles are often not recognized as that farm income. And the easiest one to think of is that lesson, the classic lesson barn where maybe 20 horses are used in a regular program. That's a significant part of that farm owner's business, but it does not count as farm income per se. So there are a few current definitions where horses are captured. So we might have things like the Feeds Act 1985. This is a very quick snapshot of a few examples of where horses show up in official documents. And again, this is relevant because when you go as Equestrian Canada or any of the provincial sport organizations to try to raise some support or some relief funding for the sector, people are going to say, well, horses aren't really counted as agriculture, or they're not counted as sport in terms of if you went to the Minister of Heritage and Sport, for example. So the case you need to make is, well, actually horses do fit into agriculture, and Agri-Food Canada would be the key spot to go to for that relief funding. So this took a fair bit of effort to try to have these conversations, and I give Equestrian Canada full applause for their efforts in terms of trying to have that conversation. If you think back to March, April, some of the other agriculture sectors that would have been going to the federal government for support, things like the horticulture sector with fruit and vegetables and their challenges with labor, milk, dairy supply, losing their export, or not their export, but into the restaurant industry as the restaurants all had to close. So there were some pretty big complicated issues. So to try to fit horses into that conversation as needing support as well was a challenge. And it's also a challenge because you remember, if you want to go to a federal government and you're thinking about all the differences across the country in terms of what's happening at a provincial level, that also makes a big difference in terms of how each province defines horses. So this leaves the really big question that came up, is a horse a farm animal and traditionally considered as livestock, or an athlete in terms of the sports and competition horses, racing horses, or are they actually an employee? And I'll just go back to that for a second, because the important part about the employee there was with the some of the other government relief funding in terms of the CERB and the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit, those types of programs. One of the questions put to anybody looking to support the horse industry was asked, well, why can't the small business owner, if they had to lay off their employees, they can still get the CERB? Well, when you lay off a horse, you still have to feed them and keep them well and maintain their health, of course. So, and we all know that costs a lot of money. So as we talked about how to have this conversation with the federal government, we decided along with Equestrian Canada that it was time for a new definition and to try to clarify this conversation that we're having. And so we came up with this term active equines, and equine livestock are raised and cared for in an active equine facility. And an active equine makes direct economic contributions to revenue generating activities at that facility. And to try to put a little bit of a box around this, they may be used for pedigree development, so breeding, sport, competition, youth and adult development and wellness, to try to give a very broad definition there. Some of the therapeutic use, physical exercise, or agritourism. So within that sport competition, we would also see that as inclusive of the racing sector. And then if we're thinking about the types of farms and facilities, giving that a little bit of a more defined wording as well. So an active equine facility, it's a commercial agricultural business using farmland, purpose-built structures, and active equines to generate revenue. They would offer a mix of services, including breeding, raising, training, boarding, and maintaining health and welfare of those active equines. And I'm happy to answer questions about this in the Q&A, but part of that was the pushback from some of the federal government staff people was, well, if there's 10 horses that you would never have been making money from anyway, what's changed in the business? So if you have 25 horses and 5 of them, maybe they're retired or what have you, they weren't contributing any money to the business. So this was to try and give a conversation around that these horses are considered part of the farm business and actively contributing to that revenue generation. And then we did also put in here that they would not include animals used in food processing or pharmaceutical industries, to make that point clear. So at the time, back in April, Equestrian Canada did put out an industry survey, and 3/4 of the survey respondents reported that they earned at least 1/3 of their income from lessons, therapy, sport, or other equine activities. And 51% of those respondents reported having 1 month or less of reserve finances and supplies. And only 19% of respondents reported being eligible for short-term income assistance. So that would be those types of programs like CERB that I mentioned. And again, this is a very compressed version of what all of the information that was gleaned from that survey. But we were able to crunch some numbers and estimate a total number of 145 and 695 active equines in Canada, going back to that definition. And then with the 1 month of supplies and finances available, we were able to estimate that there were approximately 46,000 horses in just over 8,000 facilities would be facing extreme economic pressure as a result of COVID. And we were also able to estimate from the survey and also some external sources, the median cost for commercially employed equine to maintain their health and welfare is approximately $350 a month. And I know that probably doesn't seem reasonable to people trying to keep horses in the GTA, for example, but remember this was a federal survey, so it was spread out across quite diverse regions of the country. And from these various data points, we were able to estimate a total monthly cost of $17.2 million to support horse care in Canada in the aftermath of COVID-19. And I know I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I just want to go through the recommendations that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the first recommendation from this work we did with Equestrian Canada, and provincial ministries of agriculture recognize active equines as part of Canada's agricultural system. And this would be a really important step forward in terms of industry collaboration and that government recognition of the importance of the horse in Canada. Number 2, which it should say there, is that Equestrian Canada and provincial sport organizations also adopt the definitions of active equines and active equine facilities to foster that holistic assessment of the equine sector. And number 3 was that equine organizations should work together to lobby government to collect more robust data on Canada's equine sector. If you can't count things, it's very difficult to communicate the need or the opportunities to a related industry or sector in the country. And this would be to work together across racing and all of the different disciplines. This is a collective benefit that would come out of having a better data set around Canada's equine sector. And also that equine organizations continue to engage in COVID-19 related advocacy for active equines and continue to promote the place of active equines within Canada's agricultural sector. And you can see the full report at the link on this slide. And again, just thanks to Equestrian Canada for their work on advocacy for the equine sector during the crisis. And with that, I will close off, and I think I'm right on time.
So thank you, Bronwynne, for your presentation and your contribution to the symposium. A donation of $50 in your name will be made to For the Herd.
And Bronwynne, thanks again for that, that piece, because I think one of the common threads throughout this whole symposium will be the common thread of the complexity of COVID issues and what it brings. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. I'll introduce Danielle Glanc. Danielle joined the Ontario Federation of Agriculture as a farm policy analyst in 2017. In her role, Dani is responsible for science and evidence-based policy relating to agriculture. Her portfolio topics include plant, pollinator, and animal health, including antimicrobial resistance, veterinary and livestock medicines, animal protection and welfare, pest control products, lab-made and genetic technologies, and synthetic biology for agriculture. Additional issues include production systems such as meat and abattoir regulations and crop and livestock production systems. Dani's a member of multiple groups, including the Human Wildlife Conflict Advisory Group, CFA Lab-Made Commodities, and is also a director at large for Ontario Equestrian. Dani holds a Master of Science degree in Animal and Poultry Science from the University of Guelph, and a Bachelor of Science honors degree in animal biology, also from the University of Guelph. So it's great to have an alumni with us. I've had the pleasure of working closely with Dani on the board of Ontario Equestrian, and I'm thrilled that she's able to join us here this evening. Welcome, Dani, over to you.
Well, again, thanks for the wonderful introduction, Christine, and for having me as a panelist at the symposium. So as Christine mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 with a little bit of information on the horse and ag sector. But before we begin, I just want to commend the students and staff for all their hard work in putting together this symposium. And thanks to my fellow panelists for their presentations. I'm looking forward to tuning in for the rest of the week for what I'm sure is going to be an extremely educational and informative presentations and discussions. So before I begin on the impact of COVID-19 on ag, I just wanted to take a moment to tell you about the Ontario Federation of Agriculture for those of you who don't know us. So we're the largest general farm organization in Ontario with over 38,000 members across the province. We're a producer-led lobby group representing Ontario's farming community. Our work includes government relations, farm policy development, research, lobby efforts, community representation, media relations, and more. We have a strong voice for our members in the agri-food industry on issues, legislation, and regulations governed by municipal, provincial, and federal governments. Our overall mission is to promote a sustainable farming and food sector and rural communities and advocate for Ontario farmers, their farm businesses, and their communities. So a little bit about me. So Christine gave you a really good comprehensive list of what I do. But in a nutshell, I'm one of 8 policy research staff at OFA, responsible for science and evidence-based policy. I do plant, pollinator, animal health and welfare, and my portfolio includes anything equine related. I act as the OFA equine liaison for several commodity and interest groups, along with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. In my personal life, I'm a lifelong horse person with 3 horses and an active competitor on the A's in the Hunters. And as Christine mentioned, I'm a director at large at Ontario Equestrian, where I chair the Equine Welfare and Lobby Committee. So just a brief overview, I'm just going to talk about the timeline of COVID-19, its impact on farming in Ontario, horses as agriculture, what's happened during the pandemic, and looking ahead at future steps. So the equine sector in Ontario is very diverse. It's got a lot of social and economic contributions. It touches on a variety of sectors, including sport, recreation, tourism, and health. The sector directly creates and supports a myriad of jobs, including service providers such as vets and farriers, employees and staff at facilities such as barns, stables, competition venues, and racetracks. Suppliers such as feed stores, tack, and equipment are all supported by the equine industry, as is primary agriculture such as hay, grain, and bedding. The equine sector supports the pharmaceutical industry and creates jobs in the transport industry. So as you can see, the direct and indirect economic impacts of the equine sector in Ontario are very diverse and widespread, and they make significant contributions to the local, provincial, and national agriculture sector and rural economies. So I'm not going to go too far into detail of this timeline, but there are a few dates that are key for the equine industry and ag. So on March 17th, the province declared a state of emergency and ordered the closure of a large number of businesses to help curb the spread of the virus. Included in that declaration was any facility providing indoor recreational programs. So because it was cold, indoor riding lessons were being offered. Many barns and stables were captured under this broad definition and forced to suspend their operations. On March 23rd, the government ordered the closure of all non-essential businesses for 14 days. And for clarity's sake, they released a list of businesses which they considered essential. Agriculture was included on this list. And this is kind of the critical point, and I'll talk about it in my next couple slides. So on March 30th, outdoor recreational facilities were shut down. So at this point, most equine businesses closed to the public, only allowing essential personnel in to care for their horses. Then on April 27th, the government released their framework for reopening businesses, and then it included the reopening of stables in stage 1 on May the 14th. So as I mentioned, on March 23rd, the provincial government announced their essential businesses list to clarify which businesses were allowed to open or remain open and operating. The list included businesses whose functions ensure the health, safety, and economic well-being of the population. And included on that list was agriculture, farming and food production, businesses that provide veterinary services, and businesses that support the safety of food, including animals and plant health and animal welfare. But according to the government, most equine businesses were still required to close to the public and borders, except for the base staff providing care to the horses, with the exception of barns that raise and train racehorses. So to understand why, it's important to understand how farming businesses are determined in Ontario. To be considered a legal farming business in Ontario, businesses must have what's called a farm business registration, or FBR number. So to qualify for an FBR number, a business must have at least $7,000 in eligible gross farm income annually. So Ontario regulations specify that the gross farm income of a farming business is determined in the same manner as the gross income under the Federal Income Tax Act, which Bronwynne had shared in her presentation. The FBR number also allows businesses access to other provincial and federal government agricultural programs and funding, including the resources that were created specifically for agriculture during the COVID-19 crisis. So horses are classified as livestock in several key pieces of federal and provincial legislation and planning policies. And Bronwynne provided a good summary of the key pieces in her presentation. However, most equine businesses in Ontario don't meet the definition for farm for tax purposes. The Income Tax Act and the CRA considers the following as farming. So raising or showing livestock, specifically including livestock kept for domestic use. Racehorse maintenance, meaning boarding and training facilities, and breeding. The CRA specifically mentions the following as not included in the definition of farming. So horse riding lessons, dressage training, horse boarding, and quarantine services. So unfortunately, this precludes a vast majority of equine businesses in Ontario from being captured in the definition of a farm business. And this means that they're prevented from accessing government ag-based resources and programs. So as such, most equine businesses are looked at as recreational businesses or hobby, and the animals are considered to be only for hobby or recreational use. So when the pandemic hit and closed any businesses not deemed agriculture, one of the determining factors was whether the business had an FBR number. And as I explained, since the majority of horse businesses don't qualify for the FBR program, they would not have been considered an agricultural business and were forced to suspend their operations during the pandemic until the government allowed them to reopen. So while horses are considered livestock, they're not necessarily considered farming or agriculture in the legal sense. But horses do provide a lot of valuable contributions to the agricultural landscape. So it's widely accepted that as livestock, horses require similar inputs as other farm species such as cattle and sheep. Inputs and requirements such as feed, water, housing, land and space, they're much closer to those of commercial livestock rather than domestic animals such as dogs and cats. Horses are pasture animals and they belong in agricultural areas. They can't be kept in suburban, industrial, forest, or natural areas. So as I mentioned before, they support the primary ag sector using large inputs such as hay, grain, and bedding. Horses contribute to land protection. So a great number of horse farms preserve prime ag land, especially close to the urban areas. These farms provide a transition space between rural and urban communities and protect the land from development and potential urban sprawl. So farm diversification. Horses are often found as part of a larger farming operation and contribute largely to overall farming businesses provincially and nationally. Rural development. Horses are a rural product. For the most part, horses live on rural properties, many of which are working farms and operated as farm businesses. But unlike most farm products that are sold for consumption off the farm, many of the horse activities that contribute economically to the industry, such as training and showing, also take place on farms or in rural areas. So horses may be produced, marketed, and utilized all on farms or rural farmland. They are part of activities that create links and projects between urban and rural communities, providing jobs and services within and outside those areas. So the use of horses can be integrated into rural development and is a factor for the integration of rural communities into the urban landscape. So for example, racetracks and competition venues are all revenue generating businesses, which contribute to rural as well as urban economies. So breeding farms are the primary production part of the industry. Training adds value to the product, and the recreation and competition sectors are the market for that product. Horses and equine businesses can be used to promote rural development and help bridge the rural and urban divide. So just a quick slide, kind of touching on what Bronwynne mentioned, that there's a lot of government entities that are responsible for horses. So while equine businesses weren't included on the essential services list, behind the scenes organizations and commodity groups were working hard to seek clarity on their status and see how they could be included as essential businesses. But as mentioned, there's not one ministry that assumes responsibility for the entire equine industry, which makes it very hard to get answers. So this slide just sort of shows an idea of how many ministries are responsible for portions of the equine sector. Similarly, horse sport and recreation are governed by many different national and provincial bodies, categorized usually by sport, discipline, or breed. Since no one governing body represents horses across all industries, that kind of diverse nature can make it complicated and difficult to navigate at times. So what does this all mean? So because no one ministry is responsible for equines, it leads to a lot of communication issues when seeking clarity and resources, which was especially evident during the pandemic. Ag-specific resources were created by the provincial and federal governments to help farming businesses experiencing hardships and loss as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. But because as many horse operations aren't considered farms, they had little access to resources to help their affected businesses. So during discussions with ministries for aid or direction or potential resources, the issue of data was often requested to show the economic profile and impact of the equine industry in Ontario and the effects that COVID-19 was having on the sector. But unfortunately, data for the equine industry is hard to come by. So why is there no data? The Census of Ag is the biggest statistical portrait of Canada's agriculture industry. So the data collected is used to provide and paint a picture of the major commodities of the ag industry. And it's used to develop, administer, and evaluate ag policies and used by universities and ag businesses for research and planning. In 2016, the Census of Ag captured 3,000 or just over 3,000 horse farms in Ontario and just over 64,000 horses. But it's important to note that unless the business is considered a farm, they won't be captured in the Census of Ag. And as I mentioned, most horse businesses aren't considered farming businesses. They're not captured in this data. So that kind of means that there's an unknown number of horses not represented. And since no one governing body represents equine industries across all sectors, it's difficult to ascertain the exact number of horses in Ontario, or Canada for that matter. Due to the nature of most equine commodity groups, no census-like data is captured from their membership base, and that makes it difficult to show the true economic impacts of the horse industry locally, provincially, and nationally. So the COVID-19 crisis has shown the need for more data from the equine industry to allow a true representation of the sector. So what happened during the pandemic? So OFA worked alongside provincial and national bodies to help the equine industry. In addition to many conversations behind the scenes, we published communication and updates on the state of the equine industry. Working alongside EC, OFA's board of directors approved the definitions of active equines and active equine facilities, acknowledging the contributions to ag and farming from Ontario's equine sector. We participated in EC's COVID-19 working groups and provided a letter of support for EC's lobby efforts with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So looking ahead, there's still a lot to be done to help the equine sector during the continuing crisis, as Bronwynne mentioned. Some of my perspectives are similar to hers. Some of the efforts include ongoing lobbying with provincial and federal governments to accept the definitions Bronwynne had mentioned and to accept them in the federal definition of farming. This would allow them to access ag-related resources, including business risk management programs. Other agricultural organizations need to recognize horses. Again, the federal definition of farming excludes horse businesses, but it's important that other ag organizations accept them as falling within the scope of agriculture. Education efforts. Many people don't see the true impacts of the equine industry. Education on the equine sector and its contribution to the ag landscape will help promote that equine businesses are farming businesses and are vital to the economy. Collection of more data. As I mentioned before, we need more data. If horse businesses are declared farming, we can capture them in the census of ag and paint a more accurate picture of the economic impact of the equine industries. And lastly, integrating horses into rural development agendas and strategies. The equine sector has a powerful tale to tell Ontario policymakers, not just in terms of business and employment, but also to promote sustainable growth for agriculture in rural areas. Horse businesses are integral to ag, making significant contributions to local, provincial, and national sectors and rural economies. Ensuring the equine industry is recognized as a valuable contributor to the ag sector and the overall economy will serve to protect the industry and equine health and welfare now and in the future. Thanks for having me. I think I'll end it there.
Thank you, Danielle, for your presentation and your contribution to the symposium. A donation of $50 in your name will be made to For the Herd. So Equestrian Canada has approved the symposium to be used for professional development updating hours for certified coaches. Coaches will be able to get 1 hour per night. All you have to do is fill the form, which there's the link right there, and submit it for signature. I'm now going to hand back over to Christine, who will be discussing the effect of COVID-19 on horse shows.
Great, thank you so much, Araya. As the symposium suggests, we're here to talk about the resilience, restructuring, and thriving in the due to COVID-19, but I've switched the title up a little bit. For me, we're still in the middle of this pandemic with no immediate end in sight. So for this reason, I've tweaked the title to In the Age of COVID-19. As you can see, under normal circumstances, social distancing is not facilitated at the Royal Horse Show. You know, overall, the Royal will see somewhere in the range of 300,000 visits over 10 days, and 70,000 of those are attributed to the free and paid performances at the Royal Horse Show. However, unfortunately, we've gone from this to this. It's basically being all dressed up and nowhere to go. All of our equestrian activities ceased for a period in 2020. And as we are all aware, this had a profound effect on both the sport and the industry business side of horses. I set this slideshow up as a reflection just of the timeline of 2020 and how COVID impacted what was normal day-to-day operations for everybody involved with horses, whether you were on a full or a part-time basis. Many of the things I'm going to talk about are about qualitative in nature, and they are about the feelings and key decisions that were made during the timeline. So starting us off in January and February, I surveyed the news with mild interest because, like many horse people, I'm fairly self-involved. And if it's not about horses, so, you know, I wonder if it's really relevant to me. But January and February were pretty much situation normal for myself when planning my silver and bronze shows, and also situation normal at the Royal. The news outlets had reported about a new virus. We were monitoring of the municipal, provincial, and national authorities and news outlets, just to kind of see where things went. And the first presumptive case was reported by Health Canada January 25th. And for me personally, I basically thought that's another continent, not possible here. You know, you're looking at it with mild interest. And then after the first presumptive case in Vancouver in January, I thought, oh, that's the other side of the country, can't happen in my backyard. And that's when everything kind of started to break. February and March, we called taking notice. We really started to take notice, and the Royal CEO advised the staff to take extra health and safety precautions. So we had enhanced sanitation, enhanced hand washing, everything like that at the office. The Royal had also an interesting coincidence in that we just happened to migrate our computer systems to Microsoft 360, and we also upgraded our servers. Without getting into too much detail, one of the big things we brought on board was Microsoft Teams. And for the people who don't know much about Teams, it basically allows companies to have their employees distributed remotely all over the world, but they're still able to work on projects and collaborate through video conferences, meetings, file sharing, and instant messaging. You know, February, March, the WHO actually declared a global pandemic, and the ROF CEO and the board notified the staff of the enhanced health practices, and, you know, kind of suggested we should prepare for the potential of temporary office closure. March and April, here's where everything really started to change for us. March 17th, we had just finished our staff training just 2 weeks prior to our office shutting down, which was on the 17th. And for us, this taught us an invaluable lesson in planning, forward thinking, embracing technology, and adapting on a pretty severe learning curve. As everything changes, all EC and provincially sanctioned competitions ceased. All sanctioning of future competitions ceased, and I think that's an important thing to delineate between the two. Most boarding stables and all public lesson facilities closed. So basically, countrywide, the entire industry ground to a resounding halt. Without competitions, horse sales slowed. Clients who leased horses had nowhere to compete them. Coach, trainers, stables, and boarding incomes all went to either zero or very close to zero. But however, everybody's input costs stayed the same, and I think that's already been referred to by Danny and Bronwynne as well too. The horses are technically employees, if you have a riding school, and they're not eligible for CERB, unfortunately. When we talk about all of our competitions, we refer to bronze, silver, and gold events sanctioned from coast to coast. Here in Ontario, one of the big ones was the cancellation of the Trillium Championships, which is the silver and bronze circuit. It had a profound impact on many small and medium-sized training and boarding operations. However, we actually have a really cool case study in a can-do, never give up attitude with team cooperation. For me personally, I was lucky enough to be a part of a small group of organizers that recognized the need for something or anything when shows were able to start up again. We sat down as a group and hashed out a mini circuit of 5 events plus a championship where COVID protocols could work, where it was cost effective for the competition organizers because they were taking such a big risk. We also wanted to really pay attention to horse welfare. That was a top priority for us because many horses were unfit from the time off. And we also wanted to provide some sort of sport goal and continue with an athlete pathway for people to work towards. This whole thing was a shocking revelation for most of us when COVID really shut everything down. Stable owners were forced to do double duty as head stall mucker, accountant, rider, trainer, bookkeeper, and of course, many of you were the homeschooling teacher for your children. For me, I can only imagine the number of sleepless nights and the huge amount of additional stress that many of my friends and colleagues went through, and you're still going through it with no end in sight right now. The effect of COVID on our industry's mental health will be felt for years to come. And this is something that has been magnified because many people were not able to care for their horses to the standard that they had been proud of previously. And this caused a level of shame and guilt that nobody should really ever have to carry with them. As horse people, most of us would gladly give up fancy clothes, dinners out, and discretionary spending to take care of our horses. However, the things you can't give up paying are the feed bill, the hydro bill, the vet bill, the farrier bill, and you certainly can't give up putting food on your own family's table. Financially, COVID really exposed the absence of savings and a crisis management plan for many of us. No one really saw this coming. And I think in April as well, it was the first time that at the Royal, I said the phrase drop dead date in reference to, a go or no go for the Royal. Here, May and June, communication is key. Early in May, the phrase go or no go becomes part of our daily discussion internally and also between the CEO and the board. We met with our key stakeholders, namely those would be exhibitors, suppliers, sponsors, and we discussed what kind of timeline they would need for a go or no go announcement. I made a point of reaching out to key individuals on the volunteer committees, other competition managers in Canada and the US, just on an info gathering mission. It was important to find out what was going on in different parts of the country because what happens at the Royal affects, equestrian sport across the country. The Royal, because it's a not-for-profit association, we were also mandated to have our AGM. As we were not able to do it in person as we normally would, it was done virtually. And that virtual event really provided a launch pad and impetus for putting together a virtual Royal, which of course just finished off on this past Saturday. Doing something like this would normally take 3 to 6 months of research, analysis, and decision making, and we ended up doing it in 3 to 6 weeks, which is it was a monumental task. It was late in June that the board made the very, very difficult decision to cancel the fair, and here's where communication became absolutely key. We were mandated to be ready for immediate mobilization based on whichever direction the board of the Royal decided to take, whether it was a go and continue down the road of planning or no go, cancel, and notify everybody. Within 15 minutes of the board finishing their meeting, and at that meeting, they did make the decision to cancel. The directors had in hand an official statement written by our CEO and marketing and communications manager that was approved by the board. All staff immediately got to the business of communicating this decision to relevant parties. We tiered our communications plan depending on how much of an effect the royal cancellation would have on said parties. So, you know, how much it affected their 2020 planning and their finances in 2020. Within 60 minutes, most of the equestrian, education, and agricultural world were notified of our cancellation. This is a really important thing here. It's where I want to take a minute to commend the Royal Board and the CEO and my colleagues. It was an incredible study in logistics, execution, and large-scale cooperation. So it was really an important time to be as transparent as possible with all of our stakeholders. Since July, we went into overdrive trying to prepare for our large-scale virtual event. We, as a group of staff, had limited knowledge about how to run this event from a technological, logistical, and operational perspective. One of our key questions and main consideration was, how can we retain the royal feel without trying to duplicate an in-person event? Our research that we actually had a chance to do told us that events which tried to do this really failed miserably. So part of the ambiance at the Royal is a big deal. It's walking into the ring, it's the sights, the smells, the sounds, the ability to touch the animals. So to try and duplicate that wouldn't have resulted in a very good product at the end. We had to negotiate the challenges, but also look for opportunities. It was about weighing our risk and our reward and challenging ourselves to think out of the box and step out of our comfort zone. We had to acknowledge that it was not a normal year. August to October really was go time for us. Unfortunately, we had that second wave start, and it continues to impede live events, particularly indoor events or mass gatherings. The royal timeline to producing a live event was dramatic in many moving parts, and it was a first-time experience for most of the staff. We wanted to make sure we put on something that would engage our loyal royals who have been following us for years and years and years. And however, we thought, let's look for the opportunity to expand our audience. We were actually to really go global if that's what we were trying to achieve. So come November, it was success. So we've just finished our virtual Royal. It was the first time we've ever done this. This year was only the second time that the Royal was ever canceled. So we hope it never ever gets canceled again. Although our hard numbers aren't in yet, early findings side with our first point here on the slide here that the Royal was a resounding success. The qualitative goals that we set for ourselves, we definitely achieved. Our KPIs, which are key performance indicators, we're going to gather those and measure them in the next 7 to 14 days, and that will encapsulate all of what we're going to do. So, you know, even though COVID's been very detrimental, a lot of small horse shows suffered, and a lot of medium horse shows suffered, and a lot of large horse shows suffered. And nobody has gone untouched with this, particularly from a business standpoint. And so, you know, there's a lot of dark clouds that we were under. However, with every dark cloud, you get some silver linings. The stress and feelings of uncertainty for everyone had been incredible since March and will continue to be at various levels for this foreseeable future. You know, that's one of the big detriments. A lot of this will depend where the COVID numbers go. Right now, I would encourage everyone to who has an equestrian business of any kind to plan ahead and consider how you would handle another lockdown if that's where it goes. The first COVID lockdown exposed the weaknesses in the business plans and daily operations of small and large equestrian businesses, events, and competitions. There's going to be some businesses and competitions that do not survive. That is a really unfortunate fact. As in my first point of discussion here, reassess what you are doing and what your takeaways are from the experience. What are you going to do to help your business move forward and be stronger? We need to look for ways to create opportunities for ourselves. The disruption of competitions will also have a huge impact on the athlete pathway at every level. There's a lot of young athletes across the country who have their last year as a junior. They've missed their last Jump Canada or CET medal year. They've missed riding in their last pony year. So, you know, there are those unfortunate things. And in addition, on a macro scale, you know, when you look at how will this disrupt the preparation of our Olympic team disciplines in the run up to the Tokyo Olympics, we have to look at what we can do as competition organizers, either large or small, to keep our sport and industry moving forward in the right directions. Those are some of the detrimental effects. However, it's not fair to discuss the negatives without talking about the silver linings. COVID has and still is forcing us, a lot of the equestrian sport and business world, to take a really hard look at how we do business. It's made us question our financial planning or lack thereof. There were some very difficult decisions that had to be made, and perhaps COVID forced a few to revisit their savings plans as well as their overall business plan. It may make those businesses stronger if they can get through to the other side of this. I know personally, it's made me make some adjustments personally, professionally, and financially. COVID also showed the sense of community in the world of horses and demonstrated that when people's backs are against the wall, we can all pitch in to help each other. My favorite example of this, and it's a prime example, is the amazing story of the For the Herd movement. It started with one person, and through the help of Ontario Equestrian, it took on a life of its own and was able to assist many businesses whose employees, as in the horse, were unable to work. And that was an important distinction that both Bronwynne and Danny touched on. The horses are technically employees. They work and produce income for us. It did also provide an opportunity as a silver lining for more training time for athletes and horses, less competition, and was easier it was easier on the horses, and people found other ways to either enjoy their horses or to progress with their training. There was a lot of people, I think, dressage coach Jackie Brooks is a great example. She changed her business a little bit to move more so towards online teaching and online videos for her students. And so, she can teach somebody in the US, and she spends a good portion of her day now doing that. And I think that's an incredible story of how Jackie, adjusted her business model. And finally, we're going to talk about the two most used or overused words in the English language in 2020. And those two words are pivot and adapt. I think it's important, though, to remember their meanings and why they have so much relevance. The word pivot, it means to modify a policy, opinion, product, etc., while retaining some continuity with its previous version. The word adapt is to change or to change something to suit different conditions or uses. I think those two words are really important, even if they are overused, but keep them going forward in the back of your mind. And in closing, I'll leave you with one more slide. It has been and will continue to be one heck of a ride.
Thank you, Christine, for your presentation and your contribution to the symposium. A donation of $50 in your name will be made to For the Herd Foundation.
That's great, guys. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. Okay, and as well, guys, we're going to move on to our speaker tonight. I believe Jonathan is our final speaker. I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Zammit. Jonathan's the current executive director at Ontario Racing. He's a senior finance and operations professional with a demonstrated history of working in the consumer goods, sports and entertainment, and resource industries. Jonathan is skilled in executive leadership and management, strategic planning, capital budgeting and analysis, financial modeling, financial reporting, finance transformations, internal controls and audit, and financial planning and analysis. He's an experienced business development professional with a Master of Business Admin degree with concentration in strategy. As well, he has a Chartered Professional Accountant designation. Jonathan's going to join us to talk about the effect of COVID-19 on all facets of the racing industry. Jonathan, thanks for joining, and over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today and the privilege to be at my first Equine Industry Symposium. All right. So I'm going to take a couple minutes this evening to kind of walk through how the pandemic has impacted the racing industry in the province of Ontario across our three primary breeds, that being thoroughbred racing, standardbred, and quarter horse. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the period of March to June, where we really kind of didn't know, how long this thing was going to last, where do we go from here, and come some of the programs that we put in place to kind of get us, to turn the corner on this thing, to kind of see some light at the end of the tunnel. We're still fully not out of it, but we're certainly in a much better position than we were back in late March and early April. So with that being said, I will get right into it. So the beginning is really kind of ground zero, March, towards the end of March, as my other panelists have mentioned. It was about the 19th or the 20th, somewhere in that neighborhood, where the province declared non-essential businesses to cease operations, and that impacted the tracks in the province of Ontario that were currently racing at the time. That being Woodbine Mohawk Park, Rideau Carleton Raceway up near the Ottawa region, Western Fair out by London, and Flamborough Downs near Hamilton. Those are all 4 standardbred tracks. Primarily the late winter, early spring tracks are concentrated to standardbred racing in the province of Ontario, so they were impacted directly by the shutdown. And what that meant was at the time of the announcement, in the province of Ontario, we've already drew 10 live racing cards at that time, meaning 10 live racing cards already had been drawn. Horses were entered into races. Trainers and owners had their horses ready, and that all went by the wayside between the March 19th and the 24th. That was about 864 horses that were impacted from those cancellations. In total, between the 20th and say the 31st, that tail end of March, 22 live racing cards in the province of Ontario were impacted and were canceled. And that roughly equates to about 22 live race days with 10 races per card, with 10 horses per race. It's about 2,200 horses that, just in terms of racing opportunity and the opportunity for those employed in the sector to earn an income through purse money, evaporated. So you can imagine it's a pretty substantial impact to the industry when all of a sudden your ability to earn any type of income is cut short, similar to other industries in the province of Ontario. And on top of that, in addition to the purse monies that is won by our participants in the industry, how the industry, and the track operators make the bulk of their income is through the wagers that are placed on those races. And a lot of that wagering income fuels other supplementary programs that I'll speak to a bit later in my presentation that benefit horse and horse welfare, specifically the horse improvement program, how it adds purse supplements and breeding awards and breeding income to the breeding sector. So, there was a lot of reason for concern, specifically when those races got canceled. While that was happening, we were in real time, and we had to say to ourselves, how can we start navigating this the best we can with the resources at our disposal? For the tail end of March, for those 22 live racing cards that were canceled, there was a pool of undistributed funds in the terms of purse money, which is made available under the long-term funding agreement that the industry has with the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation that were still undistributed. So in order to make the best use of those funds, since there was no racing, why not reinvest them back into the industry through some form of support payment? So for the tail end of March, between the 19th and the 24th, those 864 racehorses that were drawn into races were eligible for a $300 benefit to help ease the burden of not being able to race for any type of purse money or winning. In addition to that, at that point in the province, our best data, and my panelists have alluded to that data is hard to come by in this industry. We were able to estimate that there was about 1,652 standardbred racehorses that were qualified, meaning they had time workouts that would allow them to be eligible to be entered into races that would therefore not have the opportunity to race just because of the cessation of racing. So in addition to those 864 horses that received a $300 benefit, these 1,652 qualified racehorses also received a $300 benefit. Again, not much, but it was the best we could do at the time with the available funds we had at our disposal. In addition to that, in the standardbred industry, we also made available about $25,000 each for each group with regard to our drivers and trainers, which equated to about a relief payment of about, I think it was close to $75 per participant. Again, not substantial funds, but anything we can do at the time to help, we were going to pursue. And as this was happening all real time, we didn't have the benefit of thinking through, what is the best use of these funds. We knew we just had to get these funds out to our participants in order to maintain the welfare of these horses, as we know, and as my fellow panelists have alluded to, the upkeep of these horses and the maintenance of these horses is expensive, and it does require financial resources to maintain their welfare. As March went out the window and we turned the page onto April, at that point we had no clarity in sight in terms of how long the pandemic and the lockdown would be lasting. This was further compounded by the fact that, the thoroughbred season at Woodbine Racetrack was going to be delayed. It was announced that given the constraints due to the pandemic, there was no way that meet would start getting going. In addition to that, some of the tracks that were supposed to be running in April were also canceled. So we really had no indication of when any type of light at the end of the tunnel would be had. In order to help our participants further, again, we wanted to leverage what we had at our disposal, and in order to do that, there was a need to really understand what finances we had at our disposal. With that being said, the long-term funding agreement that we do have with the industry does provide for purses that help aid the industry. It's not the total amount of purses, but it supplements some of the additional amounts of money that is put forward by the tracks. So in order to leverage and tap into those funds, in order to redistribute them, again, as it was mentioned by Bronwynne, the government needs to know how many horses and what is the cost. Therefore, in order to start, providing these relief payments and these funds available to the participants in the industry, a task force was struck at the Ontario Racing Board level to understand how we can best address the situation and use those funds. That being forward, specifically in the periods of May and April, when the racing season is in full swing, this was something that we wanted to make sure was available to all participants in the industry, including, quarter horse, standardbred, and thoroughbred. So the task force put together a lobbying effort to the OLG and the Ministry of Finance to amend the long-term funding agreement to leverage undistributed purse funds in order to best be reallocated to the industry in the form of support payments, in order to maintain the welfare of these horses, specifically to ensure that their well-being and their fitness levels are maintained. In the event that we get back to live racing, we wanted to ensure that there was an adequate supply of horses to draw upon to get the industry rolling as quickly as possible. So once we were able to successfully convince the government and the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation to amend the long-term funding agreement to allow those funds to be redistributed to the industry in the form of support payments, the task force came up with a distribution scheme equivalent to almost half the monthly training bills per breed. So with the help of the data we had available, we were able to calculate with the resources available that this program would provide for about $1,500 per thoroughbred horse per month, $1,000 per month for each standardbred horse, and about $750 per month for each quarter horse during the periods of April and May. At that point, we only thought about those 2 months because we didn't know where we would be going and how long this would be lasting. So the plan there was to let's get through April and May, and then we can reassess in June. And that was the course of action we decided to take. Thank God that we got back to racing in early June, but at that point, that was not known. And then in order to qualify for these payments, an application process was set up and to ensure that the proper documentation was received and that this funding was being specifically directed to those who have either Ontario bred or Ontario sired horses in their stable, in addition to the fact that they would be racing in the province of Ontario. The criteria that was laid out by the task force of the Ontario Racing Board is listed on my slide. And specifically, the big thing here is we wanted to make sure that these horses were going to be racing in the province of Ontario in 2020, and that their first start, once live racing resumed, would be in Ontario. And we were looking to make sure we were helping, horses that were adequate and reasonable race horses that were going to be part of the racing scene in the near future. The last thing we wanted to see was somebody applying for a 12-year-old horse that received funding, because we know, 12 to 13-year-old, those older horses typically don't race into that point in their careers. So, there was some scrutinization of those applications and a great demonstration of cooperation through the Horse People Association, specifically the HPBA, COSA, the Central Ontario Standardbred Association, and the Quarter Horsepersons Association of Ontario, to help scrutinize those applications to ensure that that funding was going to, horses that deserve it and would be racing with us in the 2020 season. Once the application was verified by the Horse People Associations, Ontario Racing would then process those funds and get that money out the door as quickly as we could to those participants who applied for that funding. The summary of the program is located on the slide that I'm presenting currently. And from a summary perspective, I think we can take a step back and really kind of feel good about how we've helped the industry. It wasn't perfect because we were operating in real time, and we really wanted to, get that money out as quickly as possible. So we didn't have all the answers at our disposal while we were going through this process, but we tried our best, and we were able to help about 4,844 horses, specifically across the three breeds, broken down about 1,920 thoroughbred horses, 2,730 standardbred horses, and about 200 quarter horses in the province of Ontario. And in total, we were able to redirect from purses into relief payments an amount equivalent to almost $11.6 million, with thoroughbreds accounting for $5.8 million of that money, standardbred horses about $5.5 million, and quarter horses about $300,000. The total budgeted amount, the two months of April and May that were that the long-term funding agreement provided for purses, was about $13.4 million. So again, I think not having the race days available, that money was put to a good use in order to support the maintenance and welfare of the horses, in order to keep them, the bills being paid, the horses fed, and their overall well-being and fitness in tip-top shape. On the other side of the equation, we lost about 120 live racing days, and that is a significant hit, specifically for wagering and track operators. In addition to that, having that lost revenue specifically impacts some of the horse improvement programs that is funded through wagering handle, specifically, as I mentioned earlier, the horse improvement program, which provides for additional breeder benefits, breeders awards, and breeder income, stake supplements to enhance purses. So on the track side, even though we were able to take care of the horses, on the track side and track operator side, there was still a lot of pain, given that we lost 120 live race days. Towards the end of May, we started to see a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's the last kind of phase when we started returning back to racing in early June. In order to do that, we really had to act like many other industries in the province of Ontario and really come to the AGCO, who regulates our industry, with enhanced safety protocols and social distancing protocols. Horse racing was one of the first sports to come back in North America, given our unique makeup and the fact that you don't need to be at the track to consume our product. A lot of our wagering is done through digital means, through our digital platforms. So although we were racing behind closed doors, our fans and our loyal fans were able to still consume our product. However, there's still, because bars and restaurants were impacted by the shutdown, our off-track betting locations, for those who still like to enjoy the sport in a traditional manner, those OTB betting locations still remained closed, and it was a significant impact to the overall financial well-being of the industry, given that we could not take bets or accept wagering income from those participants who preferred our OTB locations. The Canadian-U.S. border restrictions provided some risk to horse supply. Usually in a typical racing season, we have a strong racing program in the province of Ontario that would attract a lot of horses from the U.S. So not having those horses did present a little bit of a risk to supply. And again, some of our stake schedules, and really understanding when we got back to live racing, some of those marquee events, Queen's Plate, Pepsi North America Cup, would need to be slotted in untraditional timeframes, which allowed us to, put the event on, but in a non-traditional manner, which we did glean a lot of learning from. In the end, again, live racing at the major tracks was something that, with cooperation with Ontario Racing, we were able to put in the safety and the social distancing protocols that were allowed us to come back safely. Ontario Racing, working with the major tracks, put in a set of minimum standards that the tracks had to follow. And before the tracks were approved to race, the AGCO needed to review those protocols and give the racetracks the all clear. And Ontario Racing helped with Woodbine Entertainment to put together a minimum standard to allow those tracks to use as a model at their own specific tracks to allow the AGCO to certify them to return to race. So in the end, the summary and kind of where we went from here is really, twofold. The summary is really that although, there was a loss of about $100 million in wagering handle, loss of on-track revenue streams through our OTBs and food and beverage, there is a silver lining in that the fact that, the pandemic has forced the industry to kind of reevaluate itself and think creatively on how we get through this and how we can band together. We thought of new and creative ways to distribute our content through our digital platforms and offerings, through our HPI Bet offering and our Dark Horse application. We've thought of new opportunities to distribute our content through securing. Woodbine Entertainment was successful securing primetime space on TSN, which, seeing horse racing on cable television, it's been a long time since we've had that privilege. So we've been able to innovate and really kind of look at the silver linings and really learned a lot from what this pandemic has presented us with. Where does the industry go from here? The racing industry should continue to operate in a safe, responsible manner for both human and equine participants. We need to continue to innovate as we go along and continue to think of new ways to distribute our product and retain our loyal racing fans. Learn from how the pandemic has taught us to think differently, because I think we're a bit complacent, and this this pandemic has really focused on us to renew our thinking around innovation. And again, as we go through this, and we're still not out of the weeds yet, never taking our eye off our number one priority, which is the highest levels of equine health and wellness for equine athletes. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where we ended up. Again, there was a beginning and a middle and an end. We're still not out of the woods yet, but hopefully, with the onset of a vaccine and some increased testing, hopefully next year at this time, we'll be back to normal operations. So thank you for that. And I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your presentation and your contribution to the symposium. A donation of $50 will be made in your name to For the Herd Foundation.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. That's great.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. So now is the portion where we'll move on to the live discussion Q&A with the panelists.
Okay, so I'll go with the first question. What are the barriers to getting a charitable arm or endowment facility to Ontario Equestrian and or Equestrian Canada? And also, are other types of associations and organizations, do they have the ability to raise and distribute funds for charitable or development purposes?
It's Christine, guys. I could probably help a little bit with that. I can't speak to the first part of the question, the barriers to getting a charitable arm, because that's not my area of expertise in not-for-profit organizations, even though I work for one. But I think maybe what we'll do is probably pass it over to Katrina, because I think she can probably provide a better answer to it. But I know EC does have a charitable portion, I think, but OE at this point does not. However, all the funds from the For the Herd definitely went to everybody in need. So OE kept its operational costs separate from that. Katrina, I'll let you answer that one.
Thanks, Christine. I don't think I can answer that question any better because I don't know what the barriers are. I can't speak for Ontario Equestrian or Equestrian Canada, but there will be representatives from both of those organizations on later in the week. And so perhaps that question can be answered through them.
If I can just take a little bit of a stab. So again, it's not my area of expertise either, but registering a charitable arm is quite an involved process and can take a long time because of tax purposes, but it also depends on the charitable purpose. So according to, I think it's the Income Tax Act as well, or the Corporations Act, to be deemed a charitable organization, you have to have a certain purpose. So things like advancement of education, religion, and it's pretty specific to do that. And if you go outside of that, it's pretty easy to lose your charitable status. So I think the time and effort and probably the setup is quite a reasonable barrier to entry, I think.
Okay, so we have just time for at least one more question. Are you feeling optimistic about the future of horse sport and welfare post the pandemic?
I can certainly chime in on that from a racing perspective. The Ontario racing industry has the benefit of being a party to a long-term funding agreement, which provides this industry with certainty for the long term, which is something that's certainly helpful in having. In addition to that, where we're going with some of the innovations that we're bringing into the industry on how we're reaching our customers, and we're trying to replenish our customers, we're seeing surprisingly in this void of sports and entertainment, given the shutdown of the 4 major sports leagues, we're seeing a resurgence in the popularity of horse racing. So we are feeling confident that once we turn the corner on this pandemic, the horse racing industry in the province of Ontario will be on solid ground, given that we do have funding in place. We have a great network of tracks, and we have a keen eye for innovation and development in order to keep this industry moving forward for all participants. So from a racing perspective, I think we're feeling good. We're in terms of where we're going.
So I just want to first of all thank Christine, our moderator, and all of our panelists, Akash, Bronwynne, Danielle, and Jonathan, for taking the time to be a part of our symposium. We appreciate your insight on these crucial topics, and we hope that as the audience found it just as informative as we did. If you do have further questions, you can look on this slide for the speaker's contact. And so you may contact them using these emails, just in case your question did not get answered because we were running out of time. So finally, I want to thank all of our attendees for being a lovely audience this evening. As a reminder, tomorrow night, we will be talking about restructuring your business for success. And then Wednesday, we will talk about the pandemic pressures on welfare. Thursday is about traceability and emergency preparedness. And finally, Friday night, we will discuss the silver linings of the pandemic. So if you have any questions from today that you think didn't get answered, you might even want to tune into one of these symposiums. They're 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern time each night, and your questions may get answered by the speakers. So to access these upcoming evenings, you can use the same Zoom link that you used tonight. And we encourage that you invite your family and friends to still join. The registration will be open all week, so don't worry about if they miss tonight. They can still attend the other symposium evening times and still get a lot out of it. So ensuing this week's webinars, you should receive an email with a link requesting you to fill out our feedback survey. We would appreciate your responses so that we can continue to improve the symposium for everyone. Also, check out our Facebook and Instagram below for daily symposium updates, and we hope to see you again throughout the week. Thanks, guys.